Einen schönen guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Wir laden Sie jetzt herzlich ein zu einer Veranstaltung, die demnächst dann auf Englisch stattfinden wird. Und der Titel der Veranstaltung ist ein Zitat von Antoine Bermond, der so auf Deutsch lautet: Von Übersetzung sprechen bedeutet von dem Werken und dem Leben sprechen, von der Art und Weise, wie sie unser Leben erhellen, in einem berauschenden Wirbel des Denkens gefangen zu sein. Wir freuen uns sehr, an diesem berauschenden Wirbel des Denkens, des Nachdenkens über das literarische Übersetzen, über das Paradoxon des Übersetzens, über das Beziehungsgeflecht, das beim Übersetzen greift und wirkt, der hier Anwesenden physisch und online, Übersetzerinnen, Autorinnen und Intellektuellen teilhaben zu können. Übersetzen können wir nicht nur als eine intime Begegnung mit einem literarischen Text betrachten, sondern auch als eine Art Beziehungen zwischen Menschen, Literaturen, Kulturen aufzubauen. Und wenn wir jetzt weiter noch wenn ich jetzt ein Zitat noch von Antoine Bermond, den ich unglaublich schätze, hier nochmal zitieren darf: Die geglückte Übersetzung eines Werkes hat stets ihr Kairos, ihren glücklichen Augenblick. So schätzen wir uns natürlich glücklich, dass wir Uljana Wolf, Isabel Cole und Mariana Dimópulos und online aus Krakau Magda Heydel haben. Herzlich willkommen. Und Isabel Cole wird das Gespräch führen. Isabel Cole ist Autorin in deutscher Sprache. Sie hat mehrere preisgekrönte Bücher geschrieben, 2 Romane und ein Langessay. Sie übersetzt ins Englische Werke unter anderem von Franz Fuhrmann, Wolfgang Hilbig und Friedrich Dürrenmatt und zuletzt Adalbert Stifter. Außerdem ist sie Waldschafferin. Sie geht in die Welt und schafft Wald zusammen mit anderen Waldschaffenswilligen und verbindet damit literarische Praxis mit künstlerischer Praxis mit waldschaffenden Praxis zusammen. Herzlich willkommen und ich freue mich sehr auf das Gespräch und ja, Sie können auch jetzt nochmal applaudieren.
Yes, thank you, Dorota, for the introduction. To talk about translation is to talk about life. That's a very broad topic. I think also we will probably be picking up a little bit on the themes in the previous wonderful podium discussion. I think that this theme, as many of us may already be thinking, this theme, however broad it is and complex, for me, it's very much focused by the situation that we're in now and made urgent by claims that we are now confronted with, that writing and translation can be uncoupled from life experience and human relationships and effectively digitized in translation or writing applications. That's a question that we might want to touch on at some point during this evening. I'll start by introducing our guests. To my left, Mariana Dimópulos was born in Buenos Aires, studied literature at the university there and also philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. She's not just a translator, she's also the author of several novels, translated in the English translation Imminence or All My Goodbyes are 2 of them, as well as short stories and nonfiction. her nonfiction includes a critical study of the work of Walter Benjamin, who she has also translated. So she translates from German and English into Spanish. Aside from Walter Benjamin, she's translated Theodor Adorno, Robert Musil, and from English, J.M. Coetzees, who we'll be coming back to later. And she teaches or taught at the University of Buenos Aires and now lives in Berlin, if I understand correctly. Very glad to have you here. Magda Heydel, who is joining us from Krakow, unfortunately due to illness. We're very glad that she's able to join us, at least online, though we're sad that she's not here with us in person, is a translator from English into Polish, including works by such major figures as Angela Carter, Joseph Conrad, T.S. Eliot, Seamus Heaney, Catherine Mansfield, and Virginia Woolf. She is also the Secretary General of the Polish Pen Club. She's an honorary member of the Polish Association of Literary Translations and a curator of the Found in Translation Festival in Gdansk. She teaches at the Faculty of Polish Studies at the Jagiellonian University and runs the Center for Translation Studies there. She's been awarded several Polish translation prizes, including the European Poet of Freedom Translation Award and the Gdynia Literary Award. And to my right is Uljana Wolf, who was born in East Berlin and had her poetry debut in 2005, Kochanie, ich habe Brot gekauft, so kind of looping back into the Polish there, which made her the youngest ever winner of the Peter Huchel Prize, followed by numerous other awards. She spent many years living between Berlin and New York, and her writing is very much shaped by translinguality, with poetry collections where you can hear that translingualism in the title, with titles such as Falsche Freunde and Meine schönste Language, and essays like the collection Etymologischer Gossip, which won the prize of the Leipzig Book Fair for nonfiction last year. She's also translated numerous poets from English into German, such as Matthias Harvey, Yoko Ono, and Eugene Ostaszewski, and has also co-translated the Austrian writer Ilse Aichinger into English. So I'd like to start by posing a question to all of you, one after another. The translator Kate Briggs, in her 2017 essay, The Little Art, describes the translator as a producer of relations, not just between languages and texts, but also between people. She speaks in this connection of her close engagement, translatorly engagement with the work of Roland Barthes, and the utopian question posed by the title of his lecture course, How to Live Together, which is one of his works that she's translated. And there his title comes to stand, in a sense, for the interpersonal or maybe even utopian dimensions of translation. So what comes to your minds spontaneously when you think of this idea of relations and how to live together in the context of translation practice? Maybe, Uljana, you could start?
Thank you, Isabel. I'm going to pick out just a very, very tiny aspect of this producing of relation, which from Kate Briggs' essay book, which I really loved. And something that really stuck to me is the way that the relations are produced through the body, which is something that really stuck with me, in which Kate Briggs describes translation as a practice that allows you to move in ways that other people move together with them, or sing songs wrongly together with other songs. This kind of mishearing and moving. And she has this wonderful moment where she breaks out and says, I have this vision where translation is a mishmash of dance moves and aerobics for everyone. Dance classes for everyone. And I just want to have that on a big banner, sort of in my room and outside of my room, because it's about the process of really having this other language, other rhythm, other relations go through you, and involuntarily you will produce different relation with your world, with your other, with the text that you're translating while you do this. And yeah, I find that, especially because I translate poetry, where the movement of the line of the verse through the body and the way it sounds in your vocal cords when you speak it out loud is very important. I think that's a practice that makes us more pay attention to one another and to our bodies in space. And I thought it was, just one last point, I thought it was really interesting that, or how Benjamin Moser framed his harsh critique of Kate Brigg's essay. I don't know if you remember that. Basically that as an editor, a writer, and a translator, he rejects the idea that someone can just translate in this playful way. It will just produce bad translations in the end. And for me, this critique goes nowhere, because it's about controlling a text and controlling meaning, controlling form. But what Kate Briggs is talking about is sort of an ethics and a process. And for me, translation has this value as a process of othering, co-authoring, co-othering, and moving.
Thank you. I thought it's also very interesting that you bring up this idea of singing together, especially after the last discussion that we had that ended literally in a round of singing. So, Mariana, maybe you could speak to this idea of how to live together in the translation context, or the relationality.
Do you hear me? Okay. So, I must confess, I'm a little bit skeptical about physical and translation, maybe because I am mostly a philosophy translator, and I have a kind of very intellectual idea of translating, and I'm very concerned about, for example, the problem of the concept, the ideas that should be or not should be universal. And so I have this kind of maybe too theoretical approach to translation. On the other hand, of course, translation is a physical work, so you are totally engaged with your body in translation. You may suffer from translation as well. It's sometimes a not very healthy work. So there are a lot of dimensions, I would say, in translation. But of course, for me, the idea of making relations through translation is crucial in this moment, because I've been working in the last few months or just few years with John Coetzee or Coetzee. And of course, this meant to me, for the first time, working with a living author. And and I had to, I would say, just go beyond myself, and this idea of kind of translation is a very isolated task. You are alone at home and you take your decisions, and then, I don't know, posterity will say if you made a good or a bad work, and that was not the case working with a living author who reads the language you are translating into, in this case, Spanish. So for me, it was a big challenge, and it was very interesting. And well, I had a lot of things to tell you about this particular case, but I will let maybe Magda answer.
I'll return to that shortly.
Of course.
Okay, looking forward to that. Magda, maybe you could speak to this question also as someone who has translated Kate Brigg's work, I understand, with your students, how you relate to these ideas of hers about relationality and living together.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, Kate Brigg's book was a huge inspiration and a very, very important object of our work with during my seminar with my brilliant students. One of them is actually, I think, now going to publish her translation of at least big chunks of this wonderful book. And of course, this was a case of working with a living author who was not there with us. We always hoped we would have a chance to ask questions or to at least write to Kate and ask her about various aspects of her work, which is a special object of translation and a special kind of writing because it's very unorthodox as far as academic essay goes. I'm not sure it's an academic essay, but it is unorthodox in many, many ways. So yeah, I think that on the one hand, I do appreciate and I do understand how important it is to be in a physical contact with the author. But I think it's more important to be in the physical contact or in the intellectual physical contact with the text itself. Reading itself is a physical activity. Reading and writing is what translator does. And it always engages yourself, your body, your whole life. I mean, that's why I think that the topic of our conversation, speaking about translation, speaking about life, is so pertinent and so rich. Of course, you can on with all those stereotypical ways of looking at translation as building relations, as creating links, as bringing people together. Well, I think there's a lot of problematic areas in this happy and optimistic image. First of all, I think that you always produce relation, which means that you are responsible for what you're doing, what you bringing about. It's not that you're just connecting and you make relation like making friends and relations. I was thinking, you know, of the phrase "friends and relations," and you can make friends, you can make relations, perhaps in that way, also. But you're responsible for producing something. That means that it's perhaps not just the natural way of meeting somebody and talking to them, but you enter into this relationship with some agenda behind your action, behind your work, intellectual and physical work. And I was thinking about my experience as a retranslator of literature. Much of my work was, well, perhaps not much, but some of my important work was retranslating, for example, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or recently Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. What comes to my mind is that the relation I produce is a completely different one from the one that these authors were producing when they published their work originally, in the first place, right? So I'm somebody who was an impossible being, an impossible subject when Virginia Woolf published Mrs. Dalloway. I was inexistent, not just in physical way, but also in the sense that my point of view, my horizon, my understanding of reality was not there and was unimaginable, right? So this is what makes me wonder about the lure and the danger of translation. Right? I am imposing myself, my point of view. If I'm not doing that, by the way, as a translator, I'm probably doing bad work, because what is interesting about translating, rereading and retranslating literature, or reading anything that crosses a bridge of time gap, is that we're reading from our point of view because we care, right? Because this text is important for us. So, you know, I would bring up this point that making this relation is a dangerous, authorial action that you undertake as a translator. Dangerous, well, not necessarily in the bad sense, but perhaps it's risky. Maybe it's not dangerous, but it's risky. And the last thought perhaps here is that sometimes when you translate, perhaps I'll have a chance to talk about that later, you're making a relation which nobody asked for. Nobody wanted you, perhaps, to do that, but you're doing that, nevertheless. And so maybe this is also an aspect of considering yourself as somebody who imposes the position on somebody else's writing and thinking.
Thank you very much. I think I'll ask Uljana. The next question is, as soon as she's finished figuring out the technology here.
Yes.
Technician here to help, please. Because we just got a sign that the battery's running low.
Yes. Okay. Now, hopefully all is well, and we will not lose Magda. Now we'll turn to Uljana in a less technical capacity and ask you about returning to this idea of relationships. You often use relational metaphors in connection with your creative practice as it moves between translation and writing and translingual writing. When you speak of false friends or etymological gossip, that's kind of anthropomorphizing, sort of proposing a kind of human relationship between languages. And I was wondering if you could shed some light on those metaphors and also talk a bit about the relationship between translating and writing in your practice.
Thank you. Yeah, metaphors. I'm not sure it's a metaphor. Yes, it is maybe a metaphor, but false friends it's a linguistic category, and as that's what I used it for. And I was. Let me start differently. I really liked what Magda was just saying about, insisting on the risky work of producing new relations that are different from the one that the source text or the original text produced. And I think this is precisely where I veered off into the risky territory as a writer and writer-translator by focusing on the aspects of producing the relations that you should not produce as a translator. Because as a writer inspired by translation, or someone who cannot stop thinking about translation, as a poet and essayist, I was able to sort of work on these fringes of translation by, for example, taking the false friends, the faux amis, the words that you are not supposed to confuse with each other when working as a translator or even just speaking. And I went full in and collected them and wrote poems with these misunderstandings in mind, because I am interested in the reality that we may see or create when we produce these illegitimate relations, and the surprise that happens, and the unexpected communication that arises between languages, but also between people, between my neurons, between me and my children, or me and my neighbors, anyone. So I'm really interested in that, and I think I also I like translating other writers who are interested in that, translingual writers who mess with likeness and sort of illegitimate connections. For example, Eugenia Staszewski, who you mentioned, or even Don Miche, a Korean American poet, who calls her work of translating sometimes cosmic dizziness. And uses it as a powerful tool to undermine the relations set out by the sort of colonial language that she translates into, the American English language. I veered off, I think, from your, but you asked me about false friends. That's
you're allowed to create new relations.
Yeah. I don't know if this works, but if you, I would be really interested to hear how the relation creation changes in your work, Mariana, when translating a dead author or a live author, but maybe that's a question that you also prepared at some point.
Yeah, maybe we could segue. I was curious, I was going to ask you next, Mariana, maybe to say a bit more about your work with Coetzees, because I understand that you have a very close collaboration, that you are practically also, in a sense, a co-author, and maybe appended to that your experience of working also, as Uljana does, as both a writer and a translator.
Of course. Maybe it's easier if I just tell you how I came to meet John Coetzees. That was in the 2010s, and I was asked for a translation. He was just directing. He was an editor in a collection published in Argentina. So first I worked in a project where he was kind of the head of the project, and I translated Robert Musil for this project. And it was very difficult. It were the women's stories by Musil. It was really the most difficult thing I ever done. And then I was invited later. I was invited to Australia, where Coetzees lives, as an author, because back then, a few years ago, or I would say 10 years ago, or maybe longer, he started a very interesting Global South project, and he had he was a professor at the university in Buenos Aires, and he started many projects heading to the idea of making bridges between the South, and meaning this South Africa, South America, and Australia. And against the idea of Global South in itself, because it is too plain in some way, and with a critical idea about global English. And that's why he started, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but he started to get published his works first in Spanish translation, and then a bit later, maybe a year later, in original English. And that was a political gesture. And he had no theory about this. He just wanted to make a statement with this kind of strategy. And then he had two books, first translated into Spanish and then published in English later. And the third, and his latest, which is called The Pole, I have translated it. So, and through this translation, we had met personally in Australia. I've lived there for 2 months. And then, when this invitation came, we worked together in this translation. He reads very well Spanish, so he checked everything. And I really learned how to work really side by side with an author, and not any author, but him. It was really a challenge. It was really interesting. And then I came up with the idea of writing a book about this experience and about his idea of making this statement against global English. And not only English, but the whole publishing system in this world we have. So the dominance of northern publishing houses, and who says what is it worth to be published or translated. And he agreed, so we started to write a book together in the form of a dialogue, and this book is now finished. And it was, I have to confess, no? I am very kind of intellectual person, and I'm kind of I have a kind of would you say mistrust? It's too much to say, but I'm kind of cautious about working with an author, and it was a very enriching experience.
And I understood from some things that I read online that when you were translating his last novel and working together with him, that he would ask your advice on some of the scenes or some of the characters, how to, that he actually rewrote some of the scenes with your input, which I thought was very interesting.
Yes, well, it was not very easy, but when I read the first draft, I found that two passages were kind of controversial, I would say. The story is told from the perspective of a woman about 45 years old, and well, it was. I would say there were two passages in special that were complicated for me, and so I thought, okay, this is the right moment to raise my voice and say that would be kind of risky for you and your book if you write this. And he was very generous, and he really listened to my message, and he rewrote these two, I would say, controversial passages. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Maybe this is something to be adopted as a practice, I wonder, to not publish the book in the original, but first have it be translated by your translator,
yes,
right?
That's not the first time I hear that. And I would say, just to come to Walter Benjamin, and a very nice phrase of his, he says, when you read, you're just perusing or just flying over a text, but when you translate the text, you just walk on the text. And that's really interesting, because there are some authors I know who say it would be wonderful, before having my book published, I would have a translation first in order to have this kind of precise reading by a translator.
Yes, translators are often editors of the text that they translate in many ways, or rewriters. So I think that is an interesting idea, although it would put the translators under even more time pressure if they had to have their translation come out a year before the authors rather than 2 weeks after the author's book came out.
But I read somewhere that Eva Hesse, who worked really closely with Pound on translating his poems, and also was in a close dialogue, at some point he explained to her a line that she did not understand, and he said, well, but it means this and this, and then she writes an essay about this, answered carefully, well, why didn't you write it like that? Something. Yeah, I know it's a dangerous thing to say, but shouldn't you have maybe written that? And then, because the text says this and that, and then he replied, don't translate what it says, translate what I meant to say. I would say this is on the other spectrum of working closely with an author, because, yeah, the experience that you just talked about was there was a shared openness, right, rather than the control of authorial intention.
May I chip in here?
Yes,
do you mind if I chip in? No, because I wanted to say that I love this idea of having of the translator being the super editor of the authors, like making the author sure that what he's written or what she's written is really what there should be in the book, which of course means that we perpetrate, using again the same mechanism of the relationship between the author and the translator as a helper of the author. But I also, I mean, which is good or bad. I mean, it's for us to judge, and probably it's different for every relationship between the author and the translator. There are some terrible authors who would not understand that translation is about difference rather than about identity, and they would ask you about every single comma that you put in the text, just worried that there is going to be a change. I mean, translation is about changing everything. And my wonderful experience here was when I took part in the Summer School of Literary Translation in Norwich. The British Centre for Literary Translation, they run summer schools. And the model for the school is that there is a seasoned translator with a group of young translators and the author who is going to be translated, who also is present during the sessions. So the most educational, if I may say so, element for me was that the authors were saying, wow, I have understood so much about what I've written. I've seen so much about what this language does. I've seen so much about the possibilities of the language, not just in translation, but in my own language. And also to cut this short, I just wanted to finish with one observation. I don't know if you share it, that the books that I really read, the books that I really understood are the ones that I translated.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was actually going to return back to you with another question going in a different direction. So we've been talking about how translation is rooted in life in the sense of personal experience or relationships with the author or with other elements of one's own artistic practice. And I wanted to broaden that a little bit because you've looked at some of the broader existential implications of translation. You've described your scholarship as focusing on translation in the context of history, memory, and violence. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to that aspect.
Yes, I'll be very happy to talk about that, and please moderate me if I'm taking all the time.
It's a broad subject, of course. Yes.
It is. Well, there are two things I'm working on at the moment. One of them is the history of literary translation in Poland after 1918, after the independence, and this is a huge aspect of how history and translation interact, and how much you can see in history when you look through the prism of translation. But the other one, which I think is more pertinent to what we are discussing here, is the one connected with memory, and especially traumatic memory and translation. I took part in a project which looked at the utterances of Polish speakers in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, where translation is staged. As you all know, the interpreter is present on the stage of the film, and her words are there. They are not deleted. They are not behind the scenes. But still, it turns out that people, when they are asked a question by the director, they produce a lot of speech. They produce a lot of words, a lot of signs, if you like. Okay? And then what ends up in translation or interpreting, well, translation through interpreting, is one neat sentence. Okay, so you have 5 people speaking emotionally in front of the church in Chełmno, and then you just get one neat short sentence produced by the interpreter. So we were thinking, what happens here? Okay, what is the relationship between the language used in the original, if you like, by the original speakers, and what ends up as a document of somebody's memory, right? Because this is not just any translation. It's a deeply existential act of translating one's formative, traumatic memories. I'm not going to talk about the consequences or the meaningful Holocaust studies here. Just to see the translation situation here. So, in fact, when you think about it, translation, memory is dependent on translation. Okay, there's no memory without translation. If you don't translate, first of all, your own feelings, your own states into words, and then if it doesn't get translated into somebody else's speech, especially in this context of historical events, if it doesn't get into the global English to be part of the Holocaust industry, Holocaust studies, right? Is it existent? Okay, so people who were studying Helmno and this bit of the Second World War were not aware of all the memory that was not translated, didn't get translated. So it made me think about how much any memory, personal or cultural, is dependent on who, how, when, and in what capacity translates it. And then again, to come back to what I said before about the relations that you produce, the risk that is involved in it. In this case, in this example, it is very, very tangible, right? You can misproduce, you can misrelate, you can conceptualize somebody else's existence, or something that shapes this existence, or the memory of a culture. Of course, much was written about that, and Isabel and myself are both readers of Sherry Simon and her wonderful book on cities in translation. So the places where languages coexist, and places which are an extremely complex objects of translation, where a lot of what Uljana just mentioned of illegitimate links are being produced. Okay? So this is just a couple of chaotic points for a larger discussion, perhaps. But I think it's vital, and it's not true that literary translation or philosophical translation, not true for me, that literary translation or philosophical translation is in this ivory tower, and it's isolated from the workings of these very complex historical and existential questions. I think when you look at interpreting, especially in these very dense moments where it's so important, you get wonderful models for thinking about what happens when you translate literature. And perhaps I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder if either of you might want to speak to these, speak to the subject of history and memory in relation to translation, if anything's come to mind. Go.
Well, I would just like to add a word on tradition and translation. I'm just kind of, I would say, not sure about whether translation is an isolated task or not. As I have just said before, I think there is strongly something in translation which is based on intellectual or artistic work, and most of this work happens in our sitting in front of our desk and trying to take the right decision. I think, on the other hand, that there is, and particularly in the case of retranslation, there is a huge weight of tradition, and I think there is there an ethical dimension in translation, because when you are retranslating a text, you become a part of a tradition of translations, for example, and you have to pay attention to history of translations, for example. And that's very clear, I would say, in philosophical translation and in non-fiction translation as well. And I cannot resist the temptation of reminding us of the importance of, and I would say, the responsibility of translation. Of course, we have just talked about misinterpretation, homonymy, or just like this kind of, and I really think that these ideas are very tempting, and they are, I would say, creative and positive. On the other hand, I am just kind of, I don't know, it's maybe because of this responsibility of translating the right thing, the right concept, just understanding in philosophy or in sociology, I don't know, just this feeling of having this responsibility, just imagining someone else at the university reading my translation into Spanish, and this fear really inside of me of making a mistake. No? And I think the two things are part of translation, and I just wanted to mention this point as well.
Oh, thank you for adding that. Is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I would like to respond to Mariana right here. I think that's a very, very important point to stress that we might have different approaches to what's right concerning genre or type of text. Because when I do translation workshops with my students translating poetry, in a way, the first thing I want to get out of their heads is that there's anything right to do. Because in poetry, mostly it means that people stick to lexicology, that they stick to the meaning of the individual word, and that they forget about the relation of the words to each other and of the words that are not there, which are also shaping the poem. In order to get into this sort of cosmic dizziness of reading what's there and what's not there, and recreating something that has a body in the new language and has what Inger Christensen, she gave the most beautiful, the Danish poet, recipe for me of what a poem is. She said it's this, I have to say it in German first, mixture of Zufall und Notwendigkeit, of chance and necessity. That produces, you know, the neighborhood of two words, or the relation of two words in a line. And in a translation, in order to create the same, not the same, but another same mixture of Zufall und Notwendigkeit, I need to be able to go away from what's right and to come back to what's right in many detours. And I think both. Again, both aspects are really, really important to translation when we also talk about our tasks, our responsibilities. I feel that I feel a different responsibility towards the poem than you do towards philosophical text. Wait, now I lost my thought. Well, I can just put a full stop here. Thank you.
Actually, that segues very nicely to the next question I was going to ask. Going back to the title of our talk, to talk about translation is to talk about life, and as Dorota mentioned, she read the quotation in German from Antoine Berman, the translation scholar that inspired the title of our discussion, and I'm just going to read it in English translation. Speaking about translation means speaking about the works themselves, about the life, fate, and nature of the works, about the way in which they illuminate their lives. And what I thought was interesting about when I looked at this quote in context, that Berman was not talking, he's talking actually less about the lived experience of the translator, although he also talks about that. Here he's talking about the life of the work. And also elsewhere in the same book, he writes of translations as having an imminent life, or a life of their own. And that was something that I heard echoed when you talked about the translation having a body, just as the poem has a body. So I was wondering if maybe the three of you could speak to this idea of works having a life of their own and translations having a life of their own.
Would you like to comment on Magda? And
well, I just what comes to my mind is that the title of this panel also has a life of its own, because it's, you know, it's so powerful to talk about translation, is to talk about life, because we decided to cut it here, cut the sentence here. Okay, it goes on, and then the meaning changes. So for me, it's like a symbol of what is possible when you translate. All right, you by minute changes you can produce new meanings and open up new. Perhaps it's not about new meanings; it's more about new spaces of meaning that open up with your reading and with your tampering with your text, if you like. If I may, I just wanted to come back to what Mariana said about the responsibility of translating, and it has to do with the life of translations, philosophical text, because well, translating Walter Benjamin is you know, it's translating literature. I mean, it's not just translating philosophical text in its academic dimension. It's a very, very demanding literary task, I think. And the beauty and the challenge of the text, well, correct me if I'm wrong, is Mariana, is that the meanings emerge from it rather than sit in it. And it's like that with great literature, either poetry or prose, I mean both, poetry and prose. And I think it's very true for great philosophy, which works with the language to make it yield new meaning, something that was not there before they were there with us. So I was wondering how you look at translating, or do you? I'm sure you do, translating this kind of text and giving it, to quote Benjamin again, an afterlife, right? A new life, a life of its own.
Thank you. I would say the challenge of translating Walter Benjamin, for example, is to hit the right point or the right place where to stay between essay or just writing and philosophy, and I wouldn't be just agree with the idea that there is mostly literature in what Walter Benjamin wrote. And for me, it was a discovery. So I worked with many other translations into Spanish, into English, into French, and what I've discovered was that I had to just like figure out where the concept was. So there were a lot of translations that were very nice, but they really didn't work because this really tough work by Benjamin, which was philosophical and which has a tradition in German philosophy, which is called Darstellung. Also the idea that philosophy is written and is constructed by a good phrase, a good sentence. So this writing was not literature, but it wasn't mathematics neither. So this kind of path between the two ways was very hard, but I would really would like to stress that there is a life of works, and that's Bergman is citing Benjamin silently, because of this idea is he took it from this very known, well-known essay by Benjamin, The Task of the Translator, and he introduces there the idea of the life of the works. And he says translations are the primal tool for works of art to have a life or an afterlife. So I think that's crucial, and I think it's not a coincidence if when Bergman talks about the letter Also, because that's exactly the point in which, as you said, there is a meaning and there is a body, and they come together. And the art of the translation, I would say, is to have this both rightly.
Thank you, Mariana. I absolutely agree, and I wanted to also go right there to the end of the sentence, or maybe it's not even the end, and to repeat, it means talking about the life of meaning and the life of the letter. And when I said earlier that I'm trying to teach my translation students when writing poetry that first they should forget that there's anything to do right here, of course I didn't mean that I'm not encouraging them to understand the poem, first of all, and understand what's going on there, and go as deep as possible. But mostly what people come from using language as communication, using language as a tool for producing, meaning that can be exchanged easily. They enter with focus on the works or the words, but not the letter. And sometimes a word is there simply because it's a work of a letter, you know, of a production of relation between a letter. And so the materiality of language is super, super important as well. And I'm glad that we ended up here and kind of agreeing also through Benjamin and through philosophy to come back to how languages basically speak to each other and correspond with each other, and how a poet translator maybe is someone who is sits right there and kind of listens with two sort of telephone ears to this conversation between the languages going on, and then maybe I, as a writer, have a third line open where I use everything that's not supposed to be done, in a way, also. But I have something else. I have another reading of this sentence, and something that just dropped into my hand today when I was actually preparing a different seminar on essay and also short forms, and came across Mary Ruefle's short talks, American poet, who wrote these very, very short lectures. She calls them lectures. We might also call them a mini essay. Can I read this one? It's kind of answers also in a different way to the Antoine Berman statement. It's called Short Lecture on Translation. I asked my friend the translator, what was the first known act of translation in the history of mankind? His answer was probably something into or out of Egyptian. I thought about that for a while and ventured a certainty. No, I said. It was when a mother heard her baby babble or cry and had to decide in an instant what it meant. I thought that was a nice, different aspect of it means to talk about life, because we translate each other all the time, not only verbally, but pre-verbally, from the very beginning on.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful return to the origins, and maybe also kind of a contrast for the last question that I wanted to pose, which is to return to our current situation that we are facing now as translators, when there are these claims that essentially language and translation can be expressed as algorithms, as you said, meaning that can be exchanged easily and can be abstracted away from individual embodied experience or elemental relationships, like you mentioned with the mother and the child as being a primal act of translation. So I just wondered if you could maybe give your thoughts on how this kind of discourse that we're dealing with here now about the relationality of translation, about its embeddedness in human life and interrelations, what role this discourse can play in the current situation, what tensions you see, or whatever comes to mind. It's a big topic, I know.
I think that as a translator, you are always happy to think, or by thinking, that your work is really useful for others. So as an author, you can always say, okay, I have my doubts, okay, yes, I've got a good critic, or I don't know how. But, you know, just in translation, you are just giving something, undoubtedly. Just, it's as clear as that. And this kind of intersubjectivity or interperson thing in translation is always kind of soothing. You would say that? Just like, okay, I've done my work and I've made something that without any doubt is useful for someone. And that's a wonderful feeling. So, and I think that's also historically and in a temporal dimension, really worth of it, worth of all the work, the efforts that translation is associated with. And I would like to stress this again. So we all have here something to do with translation, and we can be very idealistic about it, but we have to once and once again stress, okay, this is hard work, and sometimes it's not very good paid, and our bodies are just like they're fighting for this kind of work, and but there is, at the end of all of this kind of effort, this comforting idea of the others outside using our text. And that's, for me, really interpersonality in translation.
I think it's very interesting that you a couple times have implicitly mentioned the relationship to the reader that the translator has, or which I'm hearing out of what you say, your responsibility to, or the usefulness of your translation for someone, which is then
exactly
also
yes. And I think we have to be proud of it, proud of our work, and of this kind of social dimension of translation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Magda, would you like to?
Well, thank you very much, Mariana, for your declaration, which is wonderful, and I fully agree, although I'm a little bit surprised because this is un-Benjaminian. Benjamin says that the reader is not important at all. Never mind, no, that's a joke. But to connect what I heard as a kind of anxiety on Isabel's part about the artificial intelligence and the computerized translation and the technology that is going to just get in place of human beings in translation business, and the interpersonal dimension that Mariana presented. I wanted to say that, technology, I think, is a help, and it's a question of what kind of use we put it to. Let me give you an example again with computerized translations or electronic translation. All these softwares and devices that help save people's life or help people in extreme conditions with a translation system are just wonderful, aren't they? I mean, if you're in the war, or if you're a migrant, if you're fleeing your country, this is our current situation, isn't it? We all live in this world which is full of these dramatic places and situations. If somebody can understand you because they have their mobile phone with them and they can use the word processor and tell you, yes, this water, you can drink this water, okay? Or yes, go this way. And this saves lives. And you cannot think of any higher use of translation devices, translation aids, if you like. Of course, they can be put into a completely different use as well. They are used by armies, they are used by invaders, they are used by people who mean harm. But still, there is this possibility of using technology in order to make human relationships more civilized, more life-saving. On the other hand, when you think about human translation and human language and literature, philosophy as well, none of these things will ultimately help us. None of these things will, I think, be able to answer to this surplus of meaning that is produced through the body of language that Uljana was just talking about. Translation or linguistic connections between people, literature in particular, are not just about transporting units of meaning from one point to another. Okay, it's not true. We never believe anymore in this metaphor of translation as this little train that we pack with meaning and we make it cross the border, and then the meaning is the same, but the cars are different. Okay, that's not true. That's not how language works, and that's not how texts work in culture. The human dimension and the artistic dimension, the conceptual dimension of text is that they always go beyond what is meant by the signs, by the symbols, by words. There is always this possibility of interpretation. There's always this potential of new meaning that emerges, that kind of comes up from texts. So in this sense, I guess that there is no threat for translation understood as better understanding other people, right? Literature understood as communication between thinking minds and not as a passage of information from point A to point B. Of course, I'm sure that practicality of translation is going to be taken over by artificial intelligence and by electronic minds. But there's always a need for human beings to post-edit it, to make sure that everything is correct, whatever we think about correctness, of course, but also to make sure that the meanings that we want to produce are the meanings that we produced, and not perhaps by accident something else is meant in the end. There's always the chance that there is something else meant by a text, and that's the beauty of language, and again the risk of it. Okay, I'll stop here because I can go on.
Okay, thank you for that perspective, and maybe Uljana, you can have the final word on the subject.
Final words. Oh no. Thank you both for what you said. I couldn't agree more, and I want to just maybe add one more point and then add a different view on one thing. The producer of relation, we started with that term, and I think we all know, and I think that's what you talked about, the intersubjectivity, that the translators, we talk about literary translators, philosophy translators, are also the ones who find the text, read out loud, contact the author, maybe found publishing houses or start working as editors, and are doing a lot of intercultural work that is not just in the actual, I'm in front of my computer reading on my back kind of work. And that's just plain and simple, something that a machine could never do, and I think that's partly what you talked about. The second thing I want to add that I think about is a little bit in line of what I said earlier. I want to describe with a word from the Austrian writer Ilse Eichinger from her stories Bad Words, where she begins sort of a rejection of common sense language or of producing literature in a normal narrative sense by I want to use only the second best words. That's something like a manifesto of resistance in language. And in a way, I think as a poet, when I think about AI and machines, even though they produced maybe 5-6 years ago a lot of second best words and second best choices, and you could have your fun with it in a way, now they get much more better and they get it right. And our chance as humans is to not get it right or just get the second best right. I'm not saying we should produce wrong translations, but this idea of right, of correct, of that's the only correlation we have, or that's the best correlation, but that's the best expression, the best, more marketable, more faster, more whatever, is something that we should resist as translators, even though, of course, we want to strive for the beauty and the grandiosity of human relations in language. But there's something subversive about thinking that because we can err, because we are just who we are, we have the most absurd associations, we can produce a magnificent second best to the machine, and we'll be the ones laughing at the end.
Thank you. That was a very good final word. I would just like to add a short announcement that we are all invited to go upstairs and have a drink, an apéro, and find out about literary translation festivals. So, upward and onward and upward.
Not you, Magda.
Thank you. Not me, but my colleagues from Gdańsk are going to be there at the table, so it's up to them. Thank you very much.